It happened on a quiet Saturday afternoon, in a small town where everyone believed respect was a natural law. Yet, not far from a popular diner, a father's voice echoed like thunder, humiliating his own son in front of strangers. The boy, no older than 12, lowered his head as the man mocked his interests, his clothes, even the way he walked. People passing by looked away, afraid to intervene, pretending not to notice the silent pain swelling behind the child's trembling lips. What none of them realized was that a motorcycle club was parked just a few meters away, polishing chrome, listening to every word. As the father's laughter grew louder, the roar of engines suddenly filled the street, harmonizing like a warning drum. These riders were veterans of life, men who knew how words could break bones long before fists were ever thrown. They exchanged glances, each one remembering their own scars from childhood, moments where silence had allowed cruelty to bloom. The boy wiped his cheek discreetly, hoping no one saw the tears. But the bikers saw everything. They always saw everything. And in their world, shame had consequences. One rider, older and broad-shouldered, stepped forward, his boots hitting the pavement with weight. He didn't need to shout. His voice carried calm authority, earned through decades of discipline, respect, and battles fought both on the road and in the heart. He asked the father why he found pride in tearing down someone smaller. The man tried to brush it off with jokes, puffing out his chest, but the rider's eyes remained steady, silent, unamused. The boy's breathing calmed as he sensed something different: protection. Moments later, the bikers invited the child to sit with them, offering a milkshake and a smile, while gently explaining what true strength looked like. They spoke about honor, kindness, and the courage it takes to lift others instead of crushing them. The father watched, uneasy, suddenly realizing the crowd's attention had shifted. He was no longer the confident one. He was exposed, his actions reflected back at him like a mirror polished with truth. And as the engines eventually thundered to life again, the lesson remained floating in the air. Respect isn't earned through intimidation, but through example. The boy stood taller, shoulders squared, holding onto a small patch one biker placed in his palm. It meant brotherhood. It meant worth. And for the first time that day, the father understood that the world had been watching and judging, not the child but him. The road would remember this moment, because sometimes the people society expects to be rough are the same ones who defend innocence when no one else will. The boy's name was Ethan, and his world had been shrinking for quite some time. Each morning, he woke hopeful, only to be cut down by the harsh voice of the one person who should have built him up. His father, Mark, believed toughness was forged through shame, not support. When Ethan drew quietly in his notebook or practiced small magic tricks he loved, Mark dismissed it as weakness. That quiet Saturday at the diner was simply another moment in a long pattern, except this time, witnesses with scars of their own were watching. Inside that diner, the bikers' conversation had paused mid-sentence. The clatter of dishes, the low hum of chatter, and the occasional hiss from the coffee machine blended in a background noise as the father's insults cut through everything. The riders recognized the look on Ethan's face, that hollow stare children develop when they learn tears only invite more cruelty. It stirred memories, some too painful to speak aloud. One biker, named Rody, clenched his jaw, recalling the sting of his own father's words decades earlier. Rody wasn't a stranger to hurt. He had served in the military, survived battles overseas, and carried medals no one ever saw him wear. But when people asked about his past, he spoke more about his childhood than war zones. Bruises fade, he once told his club brothers, but a kid's heart? Those scars stay. Seeing Ethan shrinking under his father's shame was like watching his younger self across a time-warped mirror, and something inside him refused to let history repeat. Mark laughed loudly, pushing Ethan's shoulder, forcing him to stumble. He mocked the boy for being quiet, calling him useless, as strangers pretended not to notice. It was easier to ignore cruelty than confront it, but the bikers lived by a different code. Their philosophy was simple: protect the vulnerable, confront disrespect, and never turn your back on a kid being hurt. The table shook slightly as their leader, Flint, set down his glass and rose to his feet. The decision was made in silence. Ethan's heart raced. He wanted to disappear, not because of the bikers, but because embarrassment was his default instinct. Every time he looked up at his father, he saw disappointment, never pride. When Flint approached Mark, the diner grew quieter, as if everyone sensed the moment would become a story whispered around town for years to come. The boy's world, once shrinking, was about to crack open, and maybe, just maybe, grow again. Flint's voice was gentle, which made it more powerful than a shout. He asked Mark calmly why he belittled his own son, why he felt taller only when someone close to him felt small. Mark scoffed, crossing his arms, puffing up his chest as if challenged. He spoke about making the boy tough, about the world not forgiving softness. But Flint had seen enough of the world to know that cruelty only produced one of two things: broken spirits or hardened monsters. Neither were the outcomes for a child. Other club members gathered near, creating a subtle wall between Mark and Ethan. They didn't posture or threaten. Their mere presence carried the weight of life experience, the quiet kind earned through pain. They told Mark that real strength didn't come from humiliation, but from support. A man strong enough to build others was far more powerful than one who only knew how to tear down. Their words hit harder than any punch, forcing Mark to falter, if only for a moment. Ethan watched, eyes wide, realizing strangers were defending him more fiercely than his own father had ever done. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen. One biker handed him a small patch that read "Stand Tall," telling him that even tiny seeds grow into towering trees when given sunlight instead of storms. It was a metaphor Ethan didn't fully understand yet, but he clutched it like treasure. Mark's face reddened, anger simmering, but something deeper stirred beneath: insecurity. He had been raised the same way. Shame had been his only teacher, mockery his only language. Flint humbly explained that generational wounds passed down like heirlooms, unless someone chose to break the chain. His words were not accusations, but invitations to do better, to be better. Mark felt exposed, not by threats, but by truth. The diner's patrons held their breath as this emotional standoff unfolded. No fists were raised, no violence occurred, and yet the tension was electric. For Ethan, the world seemed to tilt slightly toward hope. The biker's code resonated in him: loyalty, compassion, and courage. As he tucked the patch into his pocket, he realized that maybe strength wasn't loud or cruel. Maybe it whispered, defended, and lifted others quietly, like these men were doing now. Mark forced a laugh, trying to brush off the attention, but his voice sounded thinner than before. The eyes around him felt heavy, as if each gaze measured his worth differently now. He snapped at Ethan to follow, but the boy hesitated, his foot frozen mid-step. That hesitation, so small and subtle, was enough to send a shockwave through Mark's chest, because for the first time, his authority didn't command obedience. It triggered a fear he didn't recognize, a realization that control built on intimidation was fragile as glass. Flint gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, asking if he was hurt. Ethan shook his head, but whispered that it wasn't about bruises. It was the words. They stung deeper than anything physical. Rhodey nodded slowly, telling him that sometimes the worst scars are invisible. Words can echo in a kid's mind for years, shaping decisions, confidence, even dreams. Ethan swallowed hard, because that echo had been his soundtrack for as long as he could remember. Mark's jaw tightened as he watched his son open up to strangers, people he assumed were rough, uneducated, and dangerous. Yet their patience, kindness, and calm dismantled his prejudices piece by piece. A silent question lingered in his mind. What did they see in Ethan that he never bothered to notice? Pride and guilt tangled inside him until he felt nauseous, not from anger, but from recognition. Outside, children rode past on bicycles, laughing freely. Their joy contrasted sharply with the heaviness inside the diner. Ethan watched them and wondered if he would ever feel that light. Rhodey crouched to meet his eyes and said softly that everyone deserves to be valued, not for what they achieve, but for who they are. Ethan felt something warm in his chest, validation, and it scared him because it was unfamiliar. Mark tried to interrupt, raising his voice, but the words faltered as quickly as they formed. He had nothing meaningful to defend, no principle to point to. All he had were memories of being belittled himself. Flint saw that tremor in his expression and understood. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about a wounded man who never healed and was bleeding onto the next generation. The question hanging between them was simple. Would he continue the cycle, or end it here? The bikers invited Ethan to join them at their table, and he sat nervously, unsure if he belonged. They spoke to him as an equal, asking about his interests. When he confessed he loved drawing superheroes and practicing magic tricks, they leaned in with genuine curiosity. Rhodey told him that creativity was a superpower, one that let people turn pain into art, fear into imagination, and silence into stories. Ethan's eyes flickered with pride, as if a quiet flame inside him had been relit. As they spoke, Mark stood to the side, arms crossed, silently observing a version of his son he barely recognized, one who smiled without flinching. He noticed the boy's shoulders relaxed, his voice steady, his gaze unashamed. It hit Mark like a truck. The way he spoke to his son determined whether Ethan stood tall or shrunk small. And in that moment, he witnessed the boy grow right in front of him, not through toughness, but through acceptance. The club shared personal stories, not dramatic or violent, but vulnerable. One biker described being mocked for his stutter until an older mentor taught him patience and confidence. Another revealed he never knew his father, and kindness from strangers shaped the man he became. Their tales wove together like threads in a tapestry, painting a truth Ethan had long suspected. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's forged by respect. The diner owner, watching quietly, delivered milkshakes to the table and whispered a thank you to Flint for stepping in. She had seen too many children wilt under harsh parenting disguised as discipline. Her voice cracked as she admitted society often ignores emotional abuse because it leaves no bruises to photograph. Ethan listened, absorbing every word, realizing the adults he admired did not fear vulnerability. They honored it. Mark lingered near the exit, trapped between pride and growth. Each story pressed deeper into his conscience, reminding him that his father had never apologized, never listened, never changed. And standing there, watching Ethan laugh with men society misunderstood, Mark wondered if he had become the very thing he once feared. The silence around him grew loud, asking the hardest question of all. What kind of legacy will you leave behind? Mark finally approached the table, but his footsteps lacked their usual certainty. He cleared his throat and asked Ethan to leave, attempting to sound firm. Yet his voice trembled, revealing cracks in the armor he had worn for so long. Ethan glanced toward Rhodey and Flint, silently seeking guidance. They nodded slowly, signaling that the moment belonged to father and son. The bikers stepped aside, keeping their distance but staying close enough to ensure safety. Mark tried to justify his behavior, repeating the same phrases he once heard growing up. Life is tough. The world won't baby you. Softness gets you crushed. But as the words left his mouth, they felt heavy, outdated, hollow. He watched Ethan's face tighten, not with fear, but disappointment. It startled him more than tears ever could. At that moment, Mark realized he wasn't preparing his son for the world. He was preparing him to feel unloved in it. Across the diner, a couple whispered about the scene. Their murmurs amplified Mark's shame tenfold. He clenched his fists, not in anger, but in panic. He feared judgment, failure, and the reflection he saw through others' eyes. This was the first time he truly saw himself, not as a protector, but as the bully. His throat tightened as he remembered being taunted by his own father and promising he'd never become like him. The haunting irony almost made his knees buckle. Ethan gathered courage from the patch, still warm in his pocket. He gently asked his father why he always mocked him, why he rarely praised anything. His voice was quiet, yet it carried decades of generational weight. Mark swallowed hard, unable to answer instantly. Because answering meant confronting wounds he buried deep beneath bravado and bitterness. The boy's eyes shimmered, not with weakness, but bravery. It was the kind of honesty only children dare to speak. Flint watched closely, recognizing the pivotal shift. If Mark walked away now, Ethan would remember this moment for the rest of his life. Pain would calcify into resentment. But if Mark listened, truly listened, he might begin to rewrite the ending. The diner felt suspended in silence, as though even the clocks paused, waiting to see what kind of man Mark would choose to be. Memories flooded Mark's mind like an unexpected storm. He saw flashes of his childhood, the cold dinners, the ridicule for every mistake, the way his father's laughter echoed when he cried. He had spent years convincing himself that harsh words built character, that emotional distance created strength. But now, watching Ethan tremble from fear of his approval, the truth surfaced painfully. Hurt people do not always heal. Sometimes they pass the injury forward. Mark's voice softened as he admitted he didn't know how to be a better father. The confession stunned Ethan, who had never heard vulnerability from him before. The boy asked if his father ever felt lonely growing up, and Mark nodded, eyes damp. For the first time, their pain connected instead of colliding. Two generations stood face to face, sharing wounds instead of repeating them. It was fragile, but transformative. Rhodey approached carefully, reminding Mark that acknowledging pain is not weakness, but the first step toward courage. He explained that choosing kindness requires more strength than cruelty ever will. Mark listened, not defensively, but curiously, as though learning a foreign language he longed to speak. The bikers did not scold or shame him. They offered truth wrapped in empathy, the sort of guidance Mark never received as a child. Ethan reached into his pocket and held up the Stand Tall patch. He whispered that someone had given it to him because they believed he deserved respect. The statement pierced Mark's heart like a needle, threading humility through pride. He asked his son quietly if he could earn the chance to give him respect too, not through force, but through change. Ethan blinked, surprised by the sincerity trembling in his father's voice. The diner exhaled collectively as the tension shifted. Patrons returned to their meals, though their eyes lingered with quiet approval. A biker near the window tapped his helmet, signaling his trust in the moment unfolding. Flint whispered that some of the greatest journeys begin not on the road, but inside the heart. Mark nodded, knowing this was his first step away from an inherited map, and toward a new path he'd draw alongside his son. Mark suggested they sit together at an empty booth, away from curious eyes. Ethan hesitated at first, uncertainty shadowing his steps, but eventually slid into the seat across from his father. The table felt like neutral territory, a small battlefield where honesty and humility would either bloom or collapse. Mark took a deep breath, not the kind meant to appear strong, but the kind taken before admitting something difficult. Ethan braced himself, unsure of what was coming next. Mark confessed that he never intended to hurt Ethan. He simply didn't know another way to parent. He explained that he thought criticism built resilience because it was the only language he understood. But watching Ethan shrink under his words made him realize he wasn't forging strength. He was extinguishing potential. His voice cracked as he admitted his fear, that Ethan would grow to resent him, that their relationship would crumble beyond repair. Ethan listened quietly, absorbing every syllable. A part of him felt relief, hearing his pain recognized. Another part feared empty promises. He asked gently if words would change into actions. Mark swallowed, acknowledging that apologies without transformation were just noise. He vowed to learn, to listen, and to support even when he didn't understand. It was a promise wrapped in vulnerability, not authority. Across the diner, Rhodey watched with subtle pride. He knew that true bravery wasn't found in roaring motorcycles or fistfights, but in moments like this, when men confronted the wounds that shaped them. Flint leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a faint smile hidden beneath his beard. These were the moments he lived for, where cycles cracked and new paths formed quietly, without applause. Ethan slid the patch onto the table between them. It was no longer just a token of protection. It became a symbol of growth. He told his father that standing tall wasn't about towering over others. It was about standing with them. Mark nodded slowly, understanding at last. For the first time, father and son spoke the same language, not of dominance, but of respect. As father and son continued talking, Flint approached with 2 milkshakes, setting them down without a word. It was a simple gesture, but its meaning was profound, a shared moment of rebuilding. Mark thanked him quietly, something he rarely said to strangers. Flint replied that sometimes the road teaches lessons parents never learned, and that's why community matters. Mark looked at Ethan, recognizing how isolated he had allowed their family to become. The conversation softened, shifting from apologies to curiosity. Mark asked about Ethan's drawings, and the boy hesitated, unsure if honesty was safe. When he finally described his sketches of heroes and illusions, Mark surprised him by asking to see them. Ethan pulled out a worn notebook, pages smudged with graphite. Instead of criticism, Mark complimented the shading, the creativity, even the bravery it took to imagine something different. Ethan felt his chest warm, not from pride alone, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being valued. It was a moment he dreamed of quietly, his father noticing him. The bikers watched, content to fade into the background now that the core of the damage had been addressed. Their job was not to replace fathers. It was to remind them of their purpose. They lived by a creed: protect, guide, and walk away when the road called again. Mark admitted he wished he could draw like Ethan, and the boy's jaw dropped slightly. It was the first time he had ever heard his father speak admiration without sarcasm. That simple sentence planted seeds of belonging inside Ethan's heart. Seeds watered not by shame, but by recognition. He asked if he could teach Mark someday, and Mark smiled, a real, unforced smile, and agreed. The diner owner approached, whispering a quiet, "Well done," to Mark, acknowledging the courage it took for him to change in public. He nodded humbly, humbled in return by her kindness. Ethan sipped his milkshake, eyes darting between his father and the bikers. For the first time, he saw possibility, not the certainty of pain. And in that moment, the world felt just a little bigger, a little kinder, and profoundly safer. After a quiet moment, Ethan approached the bikers to thank them. His voice quivered, but it wasn't fear. It was emotion stretching beyond childhood boundaries. He told them that their intervention meant more than they knew, because he often felt invisible. Rhodey placed a hand over his heart and said softly that no child should ever feel small in their own home. Ethan blinked away tears, realizing that strength did not always roar. Sometimes, it whispered through acts of kindness. Flint handed Ethan a small, folded leather wristband engraved with a simple word: worthy. He explained that it wasn't a badge of honor. It was a reminder. On days when the world felt heavy, Ethan could look at that band and remember this moment, this room, and the strangers who stood for him when silence would have been easier. Ethan promised to wear it, not to appear tough, but to remember his value. Mark walked over slowly, unable to hide the awe forming behind his eyes. He shook Flint's hand, thanking him not just for stepping in, but for showing him another way. Flint shrugged gently, saying the world didn't need more loud fathers. It needed more present ones. That sentence landed deep, carving a space inside Mark's chest where new understanding could grow. The bikers didn't gloat or lecture. They guided, like men familiar with old shadows. Ethan asked shyly if the bikers ever felt scared growing up, and several nodded instantly. Rhodey admitted fear was common, even now, but it was what you did despite fear that defined you. Another biker chimed in, saying bullies thrived on fear, but their power vanished when courage entered the room. Ethan absorbed these lessons like sunlight, warming places that had long been cold. The bikers invited Ethan and Mark to join them outside. The roar of engines greeted them, thunder rolling across asphalt. It felt like a ceremony, informal yet deeply symbolic. Flint placed his helmet gently on Ethan's head, oversized and comical, sparking laughter from everyone, including Mark. For the first time, laughter did not sting. It healed. Outside, the afternoon sun dipped low, bathing the street in a golden glow. Flint crouched down and looked Ethan in the eyes, telling him that real strength was not measured by how loudly you speak, but by how boldly you feel. He reminded Ethan that gentle hearts often become the bravest warriors because they fight for kindness when others fight only for ego. Mark listened quietly, storing every word, as if rewriting the dictionary he'd been taught. Rhodey turned to Mark and spoke plainly. Children become reflections of the love they receive. If you show them shame, they grow crooked. But if you water them with patience and pride, they rise tall and unbreakable. Mark nodded slowly, feeling the truth burn through denial. He promised, this time aloud, that he would become the man his son deserved. The bikers responded not with applause, but nods of respect. Promises meant nothing without action, and they knew Ethan would be watching. Ethan hugged Rhodey suddenly, surprising everyone. It was a small gesture, but it radiated more gratitude than words ever could. Rhodey held him tightly, whispering a final piece of advice. When the world tries to shrink you, stand tall, kid. Not above others, just tall enough to see your worth. It was a line Ethan would someday repeat to others, passing the flame forward. Mark watched the embrace, feeling a warmth rise in his chest. Not jealousy, relief. Relief that someone had shown his son the compassion he had struggled to offer. When Ethan returned to his side, Mark placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, not as a claim of ownership, but as an offering of connection. Ethan looked up, searching his father's eyes, and saw something different. Humility, remorse, and hope woven together like threads of a new beginning. Engines ignited one by one, sending vibrations through the pavement. As the bikers prepared to ride off, Flint pointed at Mark and reminded him softly, "The road goes forward. Take it with him." Mark nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Ethan slipped his hand into his father's, and this time, Mark didn't grip too tightly or pull away. The wind carried the bikers off into the horizon, leaving father and son standing in a warm silence, with new roads stretching out ahead, unwritten, untraveled, and full of promise. As the echoes of the engines faded down the street, Mark and Ethan stood alone in the quiet, carrying the weight of everything that had just unfolded. The silence was no longer tense. Instead, it felt like a sanctuary where growth could take root. Mark knelt beside his son and promised, not through grand speeches but through steady eyes, that change would be a journey they took together. Ethan nodded softly, believing him, because for the first time, sincerity filled the space between them. And under that fading sunset glow, the cycle of inherited wounds began to fracture. In the following days, Mark learned to replace criticism with curiosity. When Ethan practiced his drawings, Mark watched with pride instead of judgment. When the boy attempted new magic tricks, Mark applauded the effort, not the result. Their home slowly shifted from a battlefield to a workshop of possibilities, held together by patience and understanding. Ethan stood taller, not because he feared disappointing his father, but because he finally saw himself through eyes that valued him. The worthy wristband became more than an accessory. It became a compass pointing toward a future built on empathy. Word of what happened at the diner spread quietly through town, not as gossip, but as inspiration. Parents began paying closer attention to the tone in their voice. Teachers took an extra moment to encourage rather than dismiss. Even strangers offered more smiles than stares. The bikers returned occasionally, checking on Ethan, but always standing in the background like quiet guardians of the road. They knew their role wasn't to replace a father. It was to nudge the world toward kindness when it forgot. Every small gesture echoed louder than any act of intimidation ever could. One afternoon, Ethan walked into his room and noticed something resting on his desk. A sketchbook, brand new, waiting to be filled. On the first page, Mark had written a simple message: "Draw the world you dream of. I'll help you build it." Tears blurred Ethan's vision, not from sadness, but from gratitude. He understood then that strength didn't come from being hardened. It came from being held. And as he walked back to the living room, he caught sight of his father waiting with nervous anticipation. Proving change was not only promised, it was practiced day by day. If this story touched your heart, let it be more than just a moment. Let it remind you that words can build or break, and that every child deserves to feel worthy in their own home. Share your thoughts in the comments, and help spread awareness about the importance of emotional strength. And if you believe more people should hear stories like this, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Together, we can create a community where empathy rides further than arrogance, and where kindness becomes the road every soul travels.